Hey guys, welcome back for some more tutorials. My name is Magnet, and today we're going to be talking about playing the late game in ZvZ. More specifically, in the late game, you need to know that you have to kind of ease into it. It's not something you can just jump into right away, because ZvZ is so volatile in terms of if you lose a big roach battle, for example, they could just walk across the map and kill you. There's not a lot you could do to stop that. But you also do need to know things about unit counters in the late game that you might not have thought of, considering it might not always go that long. And kind of taking calculated risks to advance your tech while also not dying at the same time. So we'll talk a lot about that in these games, but most of this is going to be involving us actually skipping through to a point where the late game actually starts to matter. So we've already talked a lot about early games as far as baneling stuff, as far as openers, scouting, and whatnot. We've also talked about the roach game and kind of advanced into a little bit of the late game from there, which involved roach burrow, infestors, and stuff like that. But we're going to go even further beyond that today, and we're going to wait until those transitions after the big roach battles in the mid-game start to surface. So this will be on fast forward for a lot of the time. We might note interesting things that come down here, but this is all really normal ZvZ stuff. And if you're looking for general ZvZ stuff as far as in these stages of the game, there's already other replays out there for it, so this should look fairly familiar to you if you've already seen those videos. So here's the part where both players out on Zerglings and try to cancel each other's third bases, or at least protect their own third bases, so not a whole lot going on. Both players playing pretty passively, actually. Big Zergling swell coming up right now, but you should be able to defend these if you produce your own, so not too big of a deal. And we'll be taking the perspective from both these players, actually. We won't be focusing on one or the other because they're both going to be playing in the late game, or they're both going to be making interesting decisions. So both of them are getting +1/+1 at the same time to their roaches. Burrow and stuff is on the way for Curious, so this is all stuff we've seen before in the Roach versus Roach videos, and most of the time the late game will come up if neither player can really kill one another with their roaches. So a lot of times if you want to get to late game, it's either going to involve you kind of sitting back and doing it yourself, or you've gotten into so many fights where neither player was the winner that you naturally started to transition on your own. So this is a very weird and kind of organic matchup, but this isn't one of those matchups where you can just skip straight to the late game and start adding on Hive and whatnot, because then you might die to a big roach attack. So yeah, you should at least know that those are definite possibilities. One way you can kind of advance forward a little further into the late game, though, is you can start adding on spines, and this is something you're seeing Roro do a little bit. You'll also note that both of them are maxed, but they both don't believe that they can win a roach fight. So you start to see the infestation pits come down a little bit faster in this game than you would normally see. So this is what I mean about, this is how you can advance to the late game, is if you just play more defensively and just kind of wait. We also do note that Curious is using a little bit of that burrow micro, or rather burrow harassment, that we've seen every once in a while from these players. And again, that's mostly covered in the roach video, so we won't pay too much attention to that. But the bottom line is that both players know that they can't break each other. So they're both just adding on spines at their bases to prevent harassment. They're adding on their infestation pit. Pathogen glands is on the way for Roro, and we're probably going to see the same here from Curious. So yeah, there we go. So Infestor Roach is what we talked about in the Roach video. This is pretty common transition to start getting into Infestors. But if the game still continues to extend from that point, that's where things can get a little bit weird. So right now, Roro is just being brave out here, starting to clear up some creep. I don't know what Curious is doing. It's like he's not even playing right now, and he just kind of gives up the base. And actually what he's doing is he's just doing a little bit of burrow harassment over here at Roro's side, but still, this complete lack of response is really strange here from Curious. I don't really know what to say about that, but some burrow harass and stuff coming down right now. Both players in pretty much the same economic position. And funnily enough, the longer that ZvZ goes on, the less drones you're really going to want, because you want a huge army. So sitting at about 50 drones is just fine. Maybe a tad more, but you really do want the bigger army supply at this stage of the game anyway. So more burrow harass coming down, but the first infestors are starting to come on the field. And we'll just kind of fast forward through these fights, considering not a whole lot happens. So 9 infestors on the way for Curious. Roro has really not shown any interest in getting those infestors right away. At least unless I missed those, and yeah, I didn't. So he's just sitting on roaches right now. But the person that typically gets to infestors faster is usually going to have an advantage, and that's what Curious is doing right now, because if you can catch any roaches that are out of position with your fungal growth, then those roaches cease to matter. So something cool that Roro's doing, though, is he's just going right up to Hive. And Hive can open up a lot of interesting options that we just honestly haven't seen that much before in ZvZ. Specifically, I want to talk a little bit about Vipers, especially if you do have Infestors with that. Infestor, Viper, and Roach, if both players are sitting on Roach compositions, can basically be a game over, because if you can Blinding Cloud and Fungal a group of Roaches at the same time, that's an entire group of Roaches that's not participating in the battle, and you're just going to crush that because you can fire and they can't. They're stuck in position, they can't do anything. So if you start stacking up to 2 and 3 Blinding Clouds along with 2 and 3 Fungals, then all of a sudden you're getting to the point where almost his entire army can attack. So that's one thing that we really haven't seen very much of in ZvZ that is definitely possible if you're able to get up into this Hive and Viper and Infestor tech safely. And really, if you're going to do something like that, I would only sit on maybe 5 Infestors and maybe 4 Vipers or so, nothing too much more than that. But that's one big way you could get a huge advantage, by just killing an entire army that can't shoot back at you. It's not really something that we've seen, but I think it's something that we will see in the upcoming future if ZvZ starts to stabilize a little bit more to favor late game strategies. What we're seeing out of Roro now is something that we have seen in the past in ZvZ, and that is going for the Hive and going for a Spire, and this is going to be eventually for Broodlords, considering there's not a whole lot that can answer to Broodlords except for your own Corruptor count, but Corruptors are pretty vulnerable to big fungal growths and to your own Corruptor defenses. So we have seen games in the past where the 2 players just get on Broodlords and it's Broodlord versus Broodlord, and that can get really stupid. But ultimately winning in the Corruptor count is going to be what gives you an advantage in that. We have also seen in the past something a little bit more unusual, and that is Ultralisk play after the Hive. But that's more so focused around getting to the Ultras as fast as possible rather than kind of doing it conservatively. So we haven't seen that for quite a while, actually. So Hydra Dent's coming up now for Roro, or rather for Curious, I'm sorry. And the Hive is also coming up so that he can maybe potentially deal with a small amount of Broodlords. There's also a Hydralisk Den on the way for Roro, so both these players know exactly what stage of the game they're in. Both are adding Infestors, but still neither player can really kill one another. So this could get a little bit weird. We are seeing a little bit of the Bro tactics try to come into place here. This is why Fungal is so strong, because if you can catch this group of Roaches out of position, then that's just damning, because they won't have a lot of money here to keep replenishing Roaches over and over. Speaking of money, that's going to be a big factor as far as who wins the late game battles. You can see Curious's bank is huge because he's been playing a lot more defensive this entire game and hasn't really lost a whole lot, so his bank is enormous. That means that he can resupply a lot better than Roro does if they just get in sequential fights. So there is an advantage to playing defensive here, and that is that you usually will have the larger bank. You can see him just crushing Roach forces here with his fungal growths, and we're going to eventually start seeing a little bit more of the Hydralisk stuff starting to get included. But notice that now that because this fight has come down and they've traded, I mean, Curious has traded pretty well. Notice that the banks here, Curious has a huge bank at 6k, 2k, whereas Roro barely has anything. So if Curious was to win a battle like this with his Infestors, and he's been defensive and kind of holding out this entire game, this is the point where he could start attacking across the map and probably just attack relentlessly as long as he keeps up on his injects and just throw units at Curious, or rather throw units at Roro until he's dead, because he just doesn't have the bank. But that's obviously hard for you to tell in your own games, is what kind of bank the other player has, so ultimately it still will come back to you, probably just better off playing safe. So seeing a little bit more burrow harass here, nothing too crazy going on. We've talked about this a lot already. And both players still kind of very Roach-centric, so we're just going to keep waiting until these guys start to, switch up a little bit. We're starting to see the Hydralisk start to be added in a little bit, so like I said, we're easing into the late game here. We're not just going straight for it, so we're easing in by still being on huge amounts of Roaches, adding on Infestors here and there just to get an advantage in the Roach fights, and then starting to add on Hydralisks a little bit as the game goes on. Neither player is just being like, yeah, let's go straight for it. I'm going to get my Ultralisk out right now, and that's the reason they're both still alive, because if one player did that, they would probably be in pretty bad shape. So the Broodlords are coming up now here for Roro, but honestly his bank is a little bit too low, so this is one of the downsides to trying to be aggressive and trading poorly. I want to see the units lost here, and yeah, it's way higher for Roro, so that totally explains why his bank is so tiny. And now Curious is at the point where he can start attacking forward. Roro has his own defensive Infestors though, so this is where the battles can get a little bit weird. I don't know what's going on with that. So yeah, and he's still not totally confident that he can break him right now, so he's just going to continue to wait. And I wonder if he actually knows about this. He will need to scout this out and figure out what's going on as far as the Broodlords so that he can get his own Spire up, but I think he's just preempting that and putting it up anyway. And from this point in the late game, this is really all this is going to be about, is the fact that holding a 5th base is going to be really, really hard. So both these players really need to use a lot of defensive units such as spine crawlers and whatnot to defend their extra mining bases. And if they notice the other players doing so by having overlords and over their bases and whatnot, if they notice that that's coming down, they can center their attacks around trying to cancel that. So a lot of times it'll be about who can deny bases better in the late game, and that's what a lot of the late game Zerg stuff comes down to in pretty much every matchup. So something you should at least be aware of. But we're starting to see the Corruptors get added on here for Roro, so Broodlords are definitely on their way. He's going to start swapping out supply a little bit with these Roaches, and we're going to see that kind of come up. Still, the composition is Roach, Infester, Hydralisk from both players, and like I said, neither one can really engage, but the Broodlords will give you that little extra something if you need to start trying to push through armies, considering you can just throw away those free Broodlings rather than trying to expend supply to break this. But still, note that Curious Bank is huge, and it's huge because he's been playing defensive and getting better trades this entire game. So again, both players adding on defensive, static defenses. We can see a lot of spines coming up here for Roro, considering that will bolster his army power while not increasing the supply. So late game stuff like that going to be really cool or really important. And also the Broodlord is being added on for Curious. So we're getting to that Broodlord versus Broodlord stage. That's pretty rare in ZvZ, but it does happen, and it is nice to know about. So again, both players just trying to hold on to their mining bases, not trying to lose too much. Note that Curious still has a lot of resources here. Both players actually still do have a lot of resources, but getting a 5th base for either player is going to be really hard. So you can start pushing your creep out here if you can push your queens forward, and honestly Roro's creep spread is way better so that he can start trying to claim territory with his spines and whatnot, and at least see where the army is coming from if he has to defend from something. Flyer attack's also on the way to help out these Broodlords and also to help out the Corruptors. But if Curious was to see this Broodlord transition coming up and seeing this amount of Broodlords, it almost even doesn't make sense for him to make Broodlords at that point. It just makes more sense for him to try and overwhelm with Corruptors. And this is kind of a weird, sensitive point of the late game, is that if you're on this many Broodlords, going up higher than that can be pretty risky, because if they just make like 20 Corruptors and just dive in there and kill your Broodlords, especially if they have a bigger bank, then all of a sudden they can go back and morph their own Broodlords, and you won't have a lot of answers for that. So this can get to a really weird phase, but that's why the Infestors and the Hydralisks are also mixed in here to help out against stuff like that. And the big spine walls are going to be something that's really important as well. If you guys want to see a crazy late game ZvZ, you should go back and watch the finals between Roro and Symbol from the GSL quite a long time ago. It was actually back in Wings of Liberty, but we haven't even seen any new units being used in this other than the Burrow Micro. So it's pretty much the same game. And by the way, this is what I'm talking about from Curious. He just adds on a huge swell of Corruptors, and if he can just kill the Broodlords and deal with those cost efficiently, then all of a sudden it doesn't really matter what other kind of support he has if he can just blow through it with the rest of his army. So Roro's again being the brave one here, trying to attack forward. And if you're Curious, you just need to buy time and not take damage from these Broodlords until the Corruptors are out. So once the Corruptors come out, you should have a pretty big advantage here. You can fungal growth, you can throw down a million infested Terrans if you want to. A lot of stuff can start happening in these battles. The Roaches will tend to matter less and less as time goes on, but you still do need something to plow over his army once you can deal with the Broodlords. You can see the big Corruptor swell. He's dealing with the Broodlords pretty well, but that's why you also have Infestors to try and keep these Corruptors back for as long as possible, and he's also dropping infested Terrans. So Roro, you can see his supplies start to plummet quite a bit, but he's still getting a decent trade. And after all, Curious did have a way better bank, but he's losing this battle really hard because he just didn't have the tools ready, and there was too many Infestors to protect against the Corruptors. The Broodlords, there's still a couple of them alive, still some Hydralisks alive, and really that battle just kind of broke down to Roro's superior composition. I know we were saying that putting out a big swell of Corruptors and diving in there to kill the Broodlords would probably be the best idea, but if you're going to do something like that, you actually kind of need to surround with your Corruptors rather than have them all in one big ball, because fungling a big ball of Corruptors is pretty easy, and Roro, despite having the inferior bank, definitely won that battle by a huge margin. Look at the big resources loss gap there. And this, like I said, these can be really weird between these two, because Getting enough corruptors to deal with the broodlords is kind of weird. You almost do need to morph your own, but if you can kill their broodlords, then all of a sudden the rest of their army is pretty easy to mop up, assuming you have a similar composition. So these battles can be strange, and I know it sounds a little bit contradictory to say to produce corruptors against the broodlords, but honestly that battle kind of came down to Curious miscontrolling his army a lot. He got a whole lot fungled. His corruptors really weren't doing much for most of that. If you were just to fan out with his corruptors, have a big arc with his corruptors, and just fly him in that way, that would have been much, much better. He could have easily killed the broodlords, and then resupplied and morphed his own broodlords, and probably marched across the map and killed Roro. But because he handled that so poorly, Roro was able to just crash through there and really wreck his army pretty hard. If you want, we can even go back and note that the fungals were just enormous, and that's really what won this battle here for Roro. I don't know where that's advancing to because these timers don't really make much sense. Either way, let's try to get to that point again so we can watch the fungals come down, so you know that if you have your own broodlords out, that fungling the corruptors is really going to be what decides it. So we'll just watch this once again. I do have another replay, by the way, but I want to emphasize that even though I was saying corruptors should beat the broodlords, you can't just throw your corruptors away like we saw from Curious. So a couple fungals coming down here, nothing too crazy. Let's watch the rest of this battle in kind of slower motion here so you guys can see what comes down, because I know these battles are pretty weird and they're not terribly common. But so right now, I know the broodlords are on the left side. I know it's easy just to say I need to get in there with my corruptors and just kill them right away, but honestly fanning out and spending your fungal growth a little better is going to be much more important. So there's a lot of infestors over here on the other side, a lot of infestors here. If those things die for no reason, that's really bad. And especially if your corruptors die for no reason, that's really bad. And we're going to see how badly Curious kind of lost this fight and why. So notice this entire area right here is all corruptors, it's all roaches, and fungling this is so easy. There's just a couple fungals that need to come down, and all of a sudden this entire army is dead. And note that on the other side, all these infestors are dying for nothing as well. So if Curious was a little bit more on top of this battle, he would have fanned his corruptors out, he would have attacked from a better angle, he could have landed his own fungal growths and dealt with this just fine. But because he kind of derped out and kind of had all these bunched up together, there really wasn't much that Roro needed to do, since he killed all of Curious's infestors anyway. So it seemed like Curious had a really good lead on that game, but if you miscontrol your battle in the late game, then all of a sudden it ceases to matter. So that's kind of what happened with that battle, and kind of why the corruptors seem so worthless. They just all got fungled, and notice how little they're doing throughout this entire fight. He spent probably 20 corruptors to kill maybe 2 or 3 broodlords, and that's just not worth it, especially if he loses the rest of his army. So just wanted to go back and talk about that a little bit. So I hope you guys enjoyed that replay. Late game ZvZ is really, really rare, and I did have another replay for late game, but it was just so slow and was so base tradey that it was hard to really comment on. We might cover base trades and stuff in another video, but yeah, we won't worry too much more about that. The late game that you saw here is basically how late game ZvZ is going to play out, assuming you get to that point. So I guess the moral of the story is, if you want to play defensively, you're typically going to have a bank advantage, but you do need to spend your infestor energy properly as far as fungling things. You do need to get into the right hive tech, such as broodlords and whatnot, to start forcing battles that are in your favor, and not clumping up your entire army and getting it fungled. So this seems a little bit vague, it seems a little bit kind of haphazard, but this is how ZvZ typically plays out in the late game. It's all about easing into it properly, it's about not getting there too fast, and it's also about kind of being all over the map, denying your opponent from taking extra bases and then crushing them at the right time. So hope you guys enjoyed that replay. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions that will come up about late game ZvZ, so if you have any, post it down in the comments and I'll get to it. But other than that, hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will talk to you later.